It was 1979 when a group of paranormal researchers in England began to receive a series of similarly strange psychic messages. Through channeled entities and visions, they were told that a group of people were going to be brought together on an important quest, one which would eventually lead them to a secret society and a magical green stone that had once belonged to Mary, Queen of Scots. The messages kick-started an adventure across the English countryside and a chain of increasingly bizarre experiences, from deciphering Arthurian legends and unlocking clues left behind in the 17th century, to investigating a so-called occult murder, uncovering hidden relics, and even battling with an evil witch coven. And all of that's just in this first part. So join me as we begin our own journey to discover the truth behind the 1979 psychic quest for a magical green stone. This video is brought to you by viewer support on Patreon. You can join for £3 a month, which will give you early access to videos and access to our Discord server. On other tiers, you get access to Patreon-only podcasts and videos. So what are you waiting for? Find the link in the description and sign up today. Our story begins with a UFO abduction, because of course it does. With his more recent work on both Göbekli and Karahan Tepe, Andrew Collins might feel like a knockoff Graham Hancock, but back in the late 1970s, he was an avid UFO and paranormal researcher who was at the forefront of some of the most well-known British cases. He investigated them for the British UFO Research Association, and he had his own paranormal research group in Essex with friend and fellow researcher Barry King. Back in 1977, Andy investigated the case of John and Elaine Avis. They were driving home one night with their 3 young children when they suddenly spotted a UFO following their vehicle. They then experienced technical difficulties with the car before eventually coming across a luminous bank of green mist that seemed to encompass the entire road. They began to feel cold and confused. And then suddenly, there was nothing. The next thing they knew, they were back on the road again, driving as if nothing had ever happened. When they finally made it home, they discovered that their planned 45-minute journey had actually taken them 3.5 hours, and they couldn't account for any of the missing time. After their interrupted journey, the entire family began to change. They became artistic with a profound interest in the burgeoning field of Earth mysteries. They felt called to become vegetarian, and they also experienced bizarre incidents of the paranormal, alongside weird noises in their house and late-night visits from strange humanoids. They also noticed that they had acquired profound psychic abilities. They ultimately ended up looking towards hypnosis to try and unlock their memories of what had happened on their journey home. They visited with London dentist and hypnotist Leonard Wilder, who had previously written a book with parapsychologist Peter Underwood entitled Lives to Remember, which can be summed up as 1975's answer to the search for Bridie Murphy. Unsurprisingly, the Avis family came away from their hypnosis session believing themselves to have been abducted by aliens. Andrew Collins was one of the first investigators of the Avis family case, and he wrote multiple reports that were published in Flying Saucer Review. According to the book The Green Stone, this alien intelligence that the Avis family had made contact with told them that a group of people would shortly come together to perform certain important tasks involving a mysterious psychic conflict sometime in the future. I'm not sure what Andrew's response was after hearing that. Personally, I would want a few more details, but you know what these alien intelligences can be like? They always seem to be very vague and withholding, which is strange for a alien intelligence that's supposed to be far superior to ourselves. They never seem to have all the answers. Andy and Barry soon met paranormal researcher Graham Phillips, who just so happened happened to be a powerful psychic who had trained in psychology. You can think of him as a real Fortean Renaissance man. Graham told them that he had been in communication with another psychic from Worcestershire named John Ward, who had been having very strange dreams and had recently discovered that he was able to astral project, which is such a fine skill to have. I am quite jealous of that. Out of all the powers that you could acquire, I feel like astral projection would be like top of my list. I don't know why, just the thought of it seems very fun to me. John had been getting these images in his dreams about a group of people all being brought together in central England for the purposes of a quest that would lead to some big confrontation at some point in the future. Now, Andy, Barry and Graham are like kindred spirits. Not only are they all interested in the paranormal, but they're all getting messages from psychics telling them about a quest. So they began to wonder whether this was just a run-of-the-mill coincidence or whether it was some kind of strange synchronicity that they needed to pay further attention to. So the three of them put their heads together and they decided to start a paranormal research organisation because, of course, that is what I would do in this situation. And they called it, wait for it, you're not going to guess, Parasearch. They called it Parasearch. I mean, it's not the most inventive name in the world, but I guess it does get the job done. There's no questions asked when you hear the name Parasearch. Although actually, you might have questions because para could mean anything. To support the organisation's research, they also began publishing a magazine called Strange Phenomena, which has some truly wonderful looking front covers. But unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a copy anywhere. If you have a copy, please let me know because I would love to read it. Graham described Andy as an eager teenage researcher, already wise in the ways of mystery, but battling against the awe which accompanies everyone making their very first forays into alien territory. Now, I think that was his way of saying that he perceived Andy to be a little bit gullible, and that might be important to remember as our story progresses. Andy was obviously excited about this new opportunity with Parasearch, so he decided to move from Essex to Wolverhampton to be closer to the action. They ran the organisation out of Graham's flat on Oaks Crescent, and soon they had a new member join. His name was Martin Keatman, and I found this footage of him performing with his band Sheer Pride in 1983, and I couldn't not include it. Now, around this time, Andy had begun a physical relationship with a woman named Helen, and she had offered him £2,000 to put into funding the Strange Phenomena magazine, which is a very generous offer. It's not every day that the person you're dating decides to give you £2,000 so that you can keep printing a paranormal magazine. He claimed that she was both clairvoyant and clairaudient, that she had had multiple UFO sightings and had also been getting information about witchcraft and the occult via psychic means. By summer 1979, she had begun channeling the spirit of Aleister Crowley, as one does, and he had given her some strict orders. She was to write a new book dictated by him spiritually called The Inner Book of the Law, and she and Andy were to set up a new occult order. Apparently, Crowley had also commanded that Helen present this channeled book to Andy during a ceremony that was to be held on the 1st of November, during which Aleister Crowley himself would enter into Andy's body and become one with him. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get a few red flags about Helen, all right? I'm starting to think that Helen might be a little bit sus. And if you're thinking, Christ almighty, we're only about 10 minutes into this story and it's already getting weird, then all I've got to say is hold your bloody horses because you have not seen anything yet. Since starting his relationship with Helen, Andy had been getting a bunch of phone calls from concerned psychics. They were all ringing him up constantly, being like, you got to get away from her. You got to get away from her. She ain't good for you. They were like, Andy,
you in danger, girl.
But Andy was not convinced at all. And this is where I kind of differ from Andy a little bit, because I always think to myself, and I am a materialist and I'm also a skeptic, right? We all know that if you've been on my channel before. But I feel like if someone came up to me and gave me like a very specific warning about something, there would be something inside my gut that would be like, okay, I'm just going to heed the warning. I guess maybe in this scenario, it impacted his life a little bit too much to be breaking off his relationship with Helen. After all, she was going to give him $2,000. But I don't know, I just feel like if that was me, there would be something in me that I'd be like, look, all these people are telling me something. Maybe I should just listen to it. And even Graham tried to talk some sense into him. It was like, for God's sake, Andy, this woman is no good for you. But instead of listening to everyone around him, Andy said that he would only end the relationship if one more psychic gave him an unprompted warning. Little did Andy know that this final psychic that he was about to meet would change his life forever. In August 1979, the British UFO Research Association held their first London International UFO Congress at the Mount Royal Hotel in Marble Arch. Speakers at the event included Dr. J. Allen Hynek and Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who viewers of this channel will be very familiar with, along with various other names that represented the who's who of ufology, including experiences. One such experiencer was Marion Sunderland. She was the mother of a young child named Gaynor, who, along with her brother Darren, claimed to have had a UFO encounter in North Wales in July 1976. The children supposedly kept the story to themselves until March 1978, which just so happened to coincide with the UK release of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but I'm sure the two weren't related. Apparently, Marion had seen an advert for the film in a magazine. Her son then asked her what it was about, and when she explained it to him, he then went on to tell her exactly what had happened. Eventually, Gaynor did as well. The following month, Marion was listening to a radio call-in show that featured a UFO investigator named Terry Bellis, so she decided to call in and tell her children's story. It definitely raised some eyebrows, and in 1979, the case burst onto the pages of the local press when Daily Post reporter Philip Key contacted the Sunderland family for an interview. But of course, it wasn't your run-of-the-mill Q&A session. After all, this is ufology we're talking about. So to the surprise of absolutely bloody no one, they brought in a hypnotist. I swear to God, if I ever make merch on this channel, it's going to be a hat that's got Betty Hill's timeless words of advice on it.
Stay away from UFO investigators. Do not have hypnosis.
Actually, if anyone wants to help me make that hat, or if anyone's got any ideas of how I would go about making that hat, or if you're even interested in that hat, please let me know in the comments down below. After multiple hypnosis sessions, both Marion and Gaynor began to recall bizarre past lives, and they opened up more about their experiences. Marion began to talk about her own UFO sightings, as well as strange precognitive dreams that she had been having, alongside psychic phenomena. Plenty of UFO investigators were interested in the Sunderland story, perhaps none more so than Jenny Randalls, who wrote several articles and eventually a book about them. Martin Keatman of Parasearch also became interested in the case, and he began communicating with Marion. So when he spotted her at the UFO Congress in London, he decided to introduce her to Graham and Andy, and they were immediately taken with her story. Here was another UFO encounter, followed by strange psychic abilities, seemingly experienced by an entire family of people, much like the Avis family case. They all spoke for a while in the cafeteria, and then they parted ways. But as they were walking off, Andy suddenly felt someone tugging on his arm. When he turned around, he saw that it was Marion, with a concerned look on her face. She was deadly serious when she told him to be careful who he was associating with, and that there was a dangerous woman in his midst, and that he shouldn't, under any circumstances, take any of her money. She also claimed to see another woman with agitated hands, a woman that was trying to warn Andy. Marion seemed to be the final psychic that delivered him an unprompted warning, and I seriously cannot believe that it took all of these people giving him this same message for him to finally go, all right, fine, I'll stop seeing Helen. Obviously, that's if any of this happened at all, and perhaps this was just a novel way for Andy to end an unsatisfying relationship. I mean, can you imagine if you were dating a bloke and you'd offered to give him $2,000 for his Paranormal magazine, and then he turned round and was like, sorry love, I've been getting warnings all over the place about you from all of my psychic mates. We're going to have to break up. I would be heartbroken and fuming. Marion also told him, I don't know what it is, but I think you've got to be careful, very careful. There's something your group, there is something very important. I don't understand it. Please don't think I'm crazy, but I've never felt anything like it before. It's almost as if you are all involved in something which has only just begun. You're involved in something you don't understand. There is something that you must do. I'm sorry, I've taken up your time. I'll have to be off or I'll miss the next lecture. I love that she delivers this like really powerful message to him that contains all this information about something that he's going to get up to in his future. And then she goes, sorry, anyway, I'll leave you with that because Leo Sprinkle's on the stage and I don't want to miss him. I can just imagine her delivering that message and then being like, all right, ta-ra, love, see you later. These people, I swear to God. After the UFO conference, Graham and Andy got two pieces of information that seemed to reinforce this idea that they were about to be involved in some kind of quest. The first was a phone call from Terry Shotton. Now, he was another UFO investigator who had had his own sighting back in 1977. All of these guys seem to have their own sighting and then they just go straight into paranormal UFO research. It's the saw a strange light in the sky that can't be explained to Chris Bledsoe style spiritual psychic experiences with UFOs and all sorts pipeline. That's what I'm going to call it. It's very catchy. I'm hoping that it catches on. Terry was calling to deliver a message to Graham from a medium named Penny Blackwell. According to her, Terry himself was about to embark on a strange series of events with the Parasearch lads, and it was all going to kick off that autumn.
During the many years of research, one of the people we'd investigated, and who proved to be a very good psychic, was a lady by the name of Miss Penny Blackwell. One evening I got a phone call from Penny asking if I would go down to see her as soon as possible. I got down to Penny's about an hour later, and she took out a tape and explained that for the very first time she'd decided to tape herself in a trance. She played the tape, and on the tape she first of all starts to talk in quite a normal voice. Suddenly her voice changes and it starts to talk about Parasearch, the people involved with Parasearch, and a project that we were about to embark on, and that it would have quite major repercussions in the future. This was quite strange to me because I hadn't got a clue what on earth she was talking about. It just seemed to be absolutely ridiculous.
I agree with him. It does sound absolutely ridiculous, but every single element of this story is also absolutely ridiculous. So at this point, we just got to go with it. The second piece of information came from Marion. Andy had called her one night and she had given him another warning about Helen, as well as saying, I see some sort of symbolic framework which is held together by a circle of golden light in the centre, and I feel this in some way represents you. It's a little cryptic. I mean, some would say it's as clear as mud, but for Andy it seemed to make sense and it really resonated with him. She also invited him to come and visit the family home in North Wales for the weekend, and Andy jumped at the chance. But let's be honest, he was probably just happy to get out of Wolverhampton for the weekend. I know I would be. He spent the weekend there hanging out with the Sunderland family, and he got to know them better. They even ended up visiting a field where Marion claimed that the children had frequently experienced strange phenomena. But sadly, nothing happened while they were there, except Marion's son Darren did lose a milk tooth at some point during the day, and Marion placed it on the mantle above the fireplace for safekeeping. That evening, after all the kids were in bed and everyone had settled down for the night, Andy sat in the living room drinking tea with Marion and her husband Fred. Their conversation was nothing out of the ordinary for them. They were yapping away about UFOs and the paranormal, until suddenly Andy saw Darren's milk tooth hovering in the air there above the mantelpiece. Before he even had a minute to comprehend what was happening, the tooth fell onto the mantelpiece, cracked into 2 pieces, and dropped onto the ground. Now, if that was me, I would have had a Gemma Collins moment.
Nah, fuck this, I'm out of here. Get that fire exit door, I'm off.
I'd have been like, thanks for the lovely weekend, Marion. Thanks for the tea. I'm off. See you later, love. But for Andy, this was a genuine poltergeist event and he was bloody chuffed to bits. So naturally, he began planning another visit, this time with Graham and Martin in tow. During this second visit, they did some boots on the ground research with other UFO experiencers who had written letters to Marion. They ended up driving to a holiday resort to visit with a mother whose 7-year-old daughter had had a UFO experience. She'd witnessed it hovering over the family home. Andy took a series of photographs of the house and the surrounding area, while Martin, accompanied by Gaynor, questioned the neighbours. According to Martin, Gaynor started acting strangely and was looking off into the distance when she suddenly said, "They're here." I'm not trying to be funny, that is literally what she said. But nobody could see these entities except for her. But she also said that she could just kind of feel them there. I don't know, it's all vibes based. So much of this story is vibes based, so you just have to go with it. Later on, when they developed Andy's photographs, they claimed that there was a dark circular mass in the sky above the houses. In other words, a bloody UFO. To them, this was confirmation that Gaynor had some strange connection with this alien intelligence. But as far as I know, they've never actually published these photographs. Kind of makes me wonder why. Anyway, when they told Marion about all this, she was convinced that her family's bizarre experiences were somehow connected to this quest that the Parasearch lads keep being told about from every single psychic that they encounter. But little did any of them know that the quest was about to begin.
And these visions of JOANNA.
In his 1983 review of the book The Green Stone, Andy Collins wrote that the events written about in the book did actually happen.
But not in quite the way they've been presented. In fact, I wondered when reading the book whether they were describing the same events as I remember taking place. Still, that's what artistic license is all about, I suppose.
Now, I'm not going to go through every single discrepancy between Graham's account of what happened and Andy's account of what happened, because we would be here for hours and hours and hours. And you've already seen how long this video is. But I will point out some of the funnier and more ridiculous discrepancies. And we'll start with the differing accounts of their first meeting with an entity named JOANNA. On the 11th of October, Graham and Andy were paid a visit by a local occult enthusiast and reader of their magazine named Stephen Ash. In Andy's account, Stephen had actually shown up that night to be hypnotized by Graham in an attempt to uncover his past lives. When Graham tried to hypnotize Stephen, it didn't seem to work. But instead of just calling it a night, Andy proposed that he try to hypnotize Graham instead. And wouldn't you know it, it bloody worked. According to Andy, Graham began to jerk around and claimed to be in pain. Apparently, his eyes even glazed over and he stopped breathing. At that point, I'd be calling the whole thing off. I'd be trying to revive my friend, and if I couldn't do so, I'd be on the phone to the bloody ambulance. But Andy just cracked on, and Graham finally started to breathe again. And when he did, he began to mutter under his breath. Thinking it was probably wise to record whatever it was that Graham was trying to say, Andy began to tape the conversation. Only it wasn't Graham speaking. The voice that came through him claimed to be a woman named JOANNA, and she said,
I am one of you, not a spirit as you would say, but that doesn't matter. Ask Graham. He will know who I am.
She told them that it was no coincidence that the psychics around them had been receiving messages and premonitions about a quest. She also spoke of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh named Akhenaten, who she claimed was of the one, and that this quest the Parasearch lads were about to go on was to be the culmination of events which had begun with this pharaoh. She also said,
Those developed in mind within within his culture had to leave, and this was the tradition of the Exodus of Moses.
When Graham finally came out of this trance-like state, he didn't remember or believe any of it. So naturally, Andy grabs the tape and starts to play it back, hoping to convince him that it did indeed just happen. The only problem was the tape recorder had only seemed to pick up Graham mumbling the name Akhenaten 4 times. And according to Andy, at no point during the channeling of JOANNA had Graham repeated the name. It seemed like a gremlin had got in the tape recorder and just messed about with it a little bit. That was literally the only thing that Graham had managed to record. The rest was just pure silence. Andy asked Graham whether he knew who this JOANNA woman was, and the only person that he could come up with was a woman that he'd gone to Exeter Art College with years ago. Could it really be her that was talking through him? Now, in Graham's account, he mentions absolutely nothing of being hypnotized by Andy. In his retelling of the story, they just randomly decided to do some relaxation techniques, and he suddenly fell into a trance and began to channel JOANNA out of nowhere. So in his mind, he's just kind of like sat there doing a little bit of deep breathing, you know, whatever, just chilling out, and suddenly this voice just comes through him. Now, I can't tell you definitively why Graham chose to omit the hypnosis session from his version of events. Perhaps he didn't deem it necessary to mention, or perhaps he thought that suddenly falling into a trance state like Daryl Anker channeling Bashar
Well, it'll say good day to you this day of your time. How are you all?
sounded a whole lot better than his mate Andy hypnotising him. The next day, Graham and Andy decided to do some research on Akhenaten at Wolverhampton Library. They discovered that he founded Artanism, which some believe was one of the first monotheistic religions. And people like Sigmund Freud later hypothesized a connection between Artanism and the Abrahamic religions. This discovery seemed to confirm what JOANNA had said through Graham. She had mentioned the Exodus of Moses, and Freud himself had claimed that Moses was a priest of Akhenaten. Now, interestingly, Graham admitted to Andy during this research session that he had actually heard of Akhenaten before, but he had absolutely no idea why it would have come up during the hypnosis session. And he thinks that this is all probably just a result of his subconscious. To put that theory to the test, they decided to do a second hypnosis session that evening to try and communicate once again with JOANNA. This time they made sure to have Martin Keatman there as a witness. The second hypnosis session began very much like the first. Graham went into a trance state. He hyperventilated a bit. He stopped breathing altogether at one point, and then, like somebody had kind of teleported themselves into his body, he suddenly took a deep breath and he began to speak as JOANNA. And wouldn't you know it, this time she confirms to them that she is indeed the woman that he had gone to Exeter Art College with. She's not an ancient alien intelligence. She's literally just one of his old schoolmates that has somehow happened upon all of this esoteric knowledge that she needs to share with them, and she's somehow found a way to get inside his body and talk through him. Now again, if I was in this scenario, I would stop the session right there. I'd get out the phone book, because this is still like 1979 and phone books still existed, right? I'd ring her up and I'd be like, what the bloody hell do you think you're doing? If you've got a message for me, tell me now, instead of just coming through my body willy-nilly. I will be fair to JOANNA. She doesn't actually come through willy-nilly. It's only during hypnosis, at least in Andy's version of events. During this session, she told them that a race of psychic megalithic people from England, who were the same ones responsible for structures like Stonehenge and Avebury, had given their ancient wisdom to the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, and he had used that ancient wisdom to form the religious system of Artanism. When he died, his followers left Egypt and travelled to England to find the origins of this ancient wisdom, and also to seek out the power that is apparently held in ley lines and stone circles. Once they got to England, they formed a new colony with Celtic migrants, and they built a hill fort in Staffordshire Staffordshire to defend themselves from hostile tribes. It was called Bury Ring. Now, are you going to be surprised if I tell you that there is no known link between Bury Ring in Staffordshire and ancient Egypt? I really am sorry to burst the bubble, but outside of this story, I could find absolutely nothing that links the two of them. But that doesn't mean we can't sit back, relax, and enjoy Wolverhampton's answer to Lord of the Rings. JOANNA also told them that the Egyptians had brought with them a magical talisman, and she claimed that it was eventually left somewhere in Staffordshire.
That's why you are here in the Midlands, and why you are in Wolverhampton, as you will see.
Now, I promise I'm not going to keep bashing Wolverhampton throughout this video. It's a fine place. You know, the Midlands, I've spent a lot of time there. There's some lovely places in the Midlands. But I will be honest, Wolverhampton is not the place that immediately comes to mind when I think of mythical, magical quests. It is the sort of place that comes to mind when I think of a place where I would be bored enough to come up with this insane of a story. You've also got to question the odds of them being in the exact right place at the exact right time. But I guess that's just the universe doing what the universe does. JOANNA continues by telling them that centuries later, this colony at Bury Ring began to be threatened by different tribes. So they were like, we need to find ourselves a strong leader. We need somebody to protect us. So they decided to make a warrior queen named Guevara their leader, and they gave her the magical talisman. Now, if you're starting to think that name sounds a little bit familiar, it might be because according to the Green Stone,
after her death, Guevara, her chief councillors and warlords who had done so much to permanently establish the law, became the heroes of legends, and in certain communities around Britain, rewritten and altered versions of these stories formed the basis of later written accounts that eventually became integrated into some of the Celtic romances and legends.
So to put it simply, Guevara's story later became that of Guinevere, who was the supposed wife of King Arthur in the Arthurian legends. After her death, the knowledge was passed on to others, and in the Roman times it was only known to 9 people that lived in the Midlands, but it was eventually passed on to the Knights Templar in the Middle Ages, along with the magical talisman. Now, you can't have good without evil. And the Knights Templar soon found themselves threatened by a dark occult force that was intent on both their destruction and harnessing the power of the magical talisman for themselves. On the 13th of October 1307, this dark power was involved in the arrest of the Knights Templar in Paris, and they appeared to be defeated. JOANNA claimed that this arrest had only happened because they no longer had the magical talisman to protect them. Now, I'm sorry to burst in again and break up the fun with a dose of reality, but the Templars were actually arrested because they had grown quite rich. And the French king, Philip IV, was a right greedy bastard who wanted their riches for himself. So the easy way for him to get it was to accuse them all of heresy, witchcraft, occult stuff, baby eating, murder, all of that kind of stuff, and have them burned at the stake. But obviously, historical reality doesn't make for a good mystical quest, and JOANNA proceeds to tell them
the task that befell Akhenaten, that befell Guevara, and later the Knights Templar has now been reawakened. This work has now befallen many people, including yourselves.
So this ancient knowledge has gone from the megalithic people of England to an Egyptian pharaoh, back to England, into the Arthurian legends via Guevara, to the Knights Templars, and now to a group of paranormal researchers in Wolverhampton. Anyone got any questions? If you do, maybe save them, because the lore of this story gets a little bit more complicated in just a moment. JOANNA then delivered her most important message. This important quest was to start right that very moment, on October the 12th, 1979. She told them that they needed to get to the ancient hill fort that was once home to the Egyptian colony at Bury Ring, and they needed to be there at midnight tonight so that they could harness the power that they needed for what was to come. Luckily for them, it was only about a 45-minute drive away, so they really had no excuses. When the Parasearch lads arrived at Bury Ring, they found it muddy and quiet. The only sound was the wind whipping through the trees. They stood around until midnight, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Well, at least nothing visible to the naked eye. Again, it was all about vibes. This story is so vibes based. You really have got to be in the right vibes for this story. They later described the feeling that washed over them as an indescribable knowing that their lives would never be the same from that moment onwards. But that was about it. It was just a feeling. But perhaps that's all they needed. Now, if it was me, I would be a little bit disappointed if I'd trekked all the way out there in the middle of the night only to have a feeling that I could have had at home. But that's just me. I am a bit of a materialist. I want to see something. I want to actually experience it. And I guess I'm also sorely lacking in the childhood wonder department. Andy, however, was full up to the bloody brim with it. And as they're walking back to the car, he had an epiphany. He suddenly turned to both Martin and Graham and said that if Berry Ring was actually Guevara's base camp, and that if she was the real person behind the legend of Guinevere, then Berry Ring could have been the real-life inspiration for the legendary court of Camelot. I mean, why not at this point? While we're at it, why don't we throw in Spring-Heeled Jack, Pilly Wiggins, and fucking Robin Hood for good measure? I'm being facetious. As far as I know, they don't appear in this story, but the way things are going, I wouldn't be surprised. After the trip to Berry Ring, Andy decided to tell Terry Shotton about it. Remember him? He's the UFO investigator with a psychic mate called Penny Blackwell. And he tells him all about channeling Joanna and the story of the ancient power and his theory that Berry Ring might actually be Camelot. Terry then called up his psychic mate Penny, and without telling her anything that Andy had divulged to him, she starts yapping away about a psychic vision that she's been having all week of a circular field.
So you think she's seeing Berry Ring?
I know she lives not far away, but she doesn't even know about Berry Ring. Never mind having visited the place.
Terry then told Andy that all of this talk made him curious. So after his phone call with Penny, he had decided to visit the spot for himself. But unlike the others, he claimed to have had an actual psychic experience there. He claimed that he stood in the centre of Berry Ring and suddenly an image came into his mind.
Of a group of a dozen or so people in modern day clothes standing close by, as if waiting for something to happen. It just came into my mind.
Afterwards, he trekked back to his car and went to work. As you do. He's just had this crazy psychic vision and then he's like, all right, better get to work then. But while he's at work, he just couldn't shake the image from his head. So he decided to call his friend Alan Beard, another UFO investigator, engineer, and, unsurprisingly, a talented psychic. There are so many psychics in this story. It is incredibly hard to keep track of all of them, and I really can't help it. When I'm picturing all of these guys in my mind, it's just a lineup of blokes that all look like Clinton Baptiste.
This phenomena is Clinton Baptiste.
Right. While on the phone with Terry, Alan picked up a series of strange psychic images.
I had the impression, a vision if you like, of a white object floating through space towards me. It kept on coming towards me and shrank again in size. This was something strange because I've never had anything like this happen to me before, images or impressions. It came totally out of the blue. The final impression I had of it was that it was coming towards me, shrinking in size. The smallest it was when it stopped in front of me, and it was the size and impression of a green stone mounted on an old silver ring.
Who would have thought a green stone? Alan later relayed the story of what he'd seen to Andy, and while they're on the phone together, Alan got another psychic vision. I don't know about you, but I would be worn out. I'd be like, for God's sake, please, just give it a rest. I've had enough psychic visions. This time, he supposedly saw a stone slab and he got the words King Arthur and the Round Table zapped into his mind. What a bloody coincidence.
There is no such thing as a coincidence.
I mean, of course, none of them told them anything about what they'd been up to. At this point, everyone was at a bit of a loss as to what to do. So they decided to get back in contact with JOANNA via hypnotising Graham for the third time. I say hypnosis because that's how Andy describes it in his book, The Seventh Sword. But in the Greenstone, it's described as falling into a trance state. And sometimes they'll refer to the tactics used in these sessions as relaxation techniques. But we all know it's friggin' hypnosis. And they try and obscure it by using all of these different words so that you won't know that it's a bunch of guys that are just hypnotising each other and putting thoughts into each other's head. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm ruining the story. The third session with JOANNA was by far the most illuminating. She was ready to spill the beans and tell them exactly what this quest of theirs was going to entail. She began by telling them more about the magical talisman that she'd referred to in their previous sessions. This time, she called it the Meonia stone, and she said,
Alan Beard is correct. It is a small emerald green stone which was, and still could be, set within a ring. He also saw it in the forms it took before settling into its present size and shape. First it was a stone tablet, and then an egg, the Philosopher's Stone, or to give it another name, the Philosopher's Egg.
You'll note here that Meonia is actually an anagram of I am one, and according to Andy,
the one is an expression of the macrocosm, reflected in microcosm within nature, within ourselves, and within our every action in life. One affects the other, and vice versa, leading to the Hermetic axiom of as above, so below.
This stone was supposedly able to ward off great evil forces that wanted to destroy the ancient knowledge that had come from the megalithic people. Now, if you're finding this a little hard to follow, don't worry, you're not alone. But it is going to get much, much worse from this moment forward. So remember previously, JOANNA told the Parasearch lads that the Knights Templar had been arrested in 1307 because they no longer had the magical talisman, now known as the Meonia stone. Well, JOANNA elaborated on the story, and according to her, a few of the Templars had survived, and they had gone on to found Rosicrucianism in 17th century Germany. It's probably important to note here that around the same time that the Parasearch lads are getting all of this supposedly psychic channeled information, the public had become quite enamoured with conspiracy theories about the Knights Templar and what had happened to them. Some claimed that they had discovered the Holy Grail, that they had become Freemasons, that they themselves were created by a fraternal order called the Priory of Sion, and that the Holy Grail was actually Mary Magdalene's womb and a child that she may have had with Jesus. These theories got even more popular with the release of the book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail in 1982.
The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, now in corgi paperback. Possibly the most shattering theory of the last 2,000 years.
Coincidentally, came out a year before The Greenstone was published. I'm sure they're not related. One of the book's authors, Henry Lincoln, had already primed the public for this information with a series of pseudo-historical documentaries that aired on BBC Two in November 1979.
The Rose on the Cross, the emblem of the Rosicrucians, who burst upon the world in the 17th century in the Rosicrucian manifestos written by Valentin Andrea, Grand Master of the Priory. The Rose Cross, which seems to echo the rose-red cross emblem of the Templars, birthmark of the Merovingians. The Rosicrucians.
It's at this point that the influences become glaringly apparent. It's almost as if the Parasearch lads wanted to start their own Rennes-le-Chateau-esque mystery in the Midlands. Perhaps one of their psychic mates had told them about the future popularity of the Da Vinci Code, and they were like, you know what, we want a bit of that action too. And honestly, who can blame them? For what it's worth, I think that The Greenstone would have made a much better movie, but I can't really see Tom Hanks in a starring role. In The Greenstone, Stone, Graham Phillips and Martin Keatman write that Henry Lincoln
suggested that the Rosicrucians were heirs to the lost wealth of the Templars. When the order was outlawed, vast amounts of their wealth disappeared and was never found. Lincoln advocated that the Rosicrucians were eventually founded using this money as a secret underground group to carry on where the Templars left off.
Now, as far as I'm aware, there are no tangible links between the Rosicrucians and the Knights Templar. But again, recorded history is not going to get in the way of the Parasearch lads spinning this yarn. JOANNA then went on to claim that the ancestors of the ancient wisdom that had remained in England became adherents of Roman Catholicism and found themselves persecuted. The Catholics put their faith in Mary, Queen of Scots, and viewed her as the legitimate sovereign of England. According to JOANNA, they believed that if they gave Mary the Meonia stone, then she could quite possibly overthrow Protestantism in England. It didn't work out very well because she spent around 18 years imprisoned in both Scotland and England. Coincidentally, she was held captive at Chartley Castle, which was around 10 miles from Bury Ring. While she was held there, JOANNA claimed that she was visited by the then 15-year-old Robert Catesby, along with his uncle George Winter, and she personally gave Catesby the Meonia stone. When Mary's son, James I, became King of England and Ireland in 1603, many Catholics hoped that their years of persecution were over. He was a Protestant, but his mother was a Catholic, and people hoped that he would bring both sides together. But things just seemed to get worse. So, in 1604, Robert Catesby began to conceive a deadly plot.
On Sunday the 20th of May, 1604, in the Duck and Drake Inn just off the Strand in London, 5 men met in an upper room. They were there to plan the assassination of King James I and the destruction of his entire government. This gunpowder plot was not the brainchild of the infamous Guy Fawkes. They'd met at the summons of a young man called Robert, or Robin, Catesby.
Catesby's clearly the leader. He's the man with charisma, the man who recruits other people. He's the man who has the idea of blowing up the Palace of Westminster.
Now, bear in mind that according to JOANNA, Catesby had possession of the Meonia stone, and she claimed that those responsible for what would become known as the gunpowder plot had attempted to harness its power, but
in becoming men of violence, they had lost what they once possessed: the power to defeat evil.
Guy Fawkes is the name we associate most closely with the plot. When, at about midnight on the 4th of November, 1605, a search party discovered him, lurking in the vaults beneath the House of Lords. He was just hours away from blowing apart the very fabric of the English state.
After the plot was rumbled, the conspirators fled to the Midlands and ended up at Huddington Court in Worcestershire. It was the home of Robert Winter, Catesby's cousin and one of the plotters. And while they were there, Catesby decided to give the Meonia stone to Robert's wife Gertrude for safekeeping. The plotters spent one night there before moving on. They would later be apprehended and executed, leaving poor Gertrude to figure out what the bloody hell she's supposed to do with the Meonia stone. She turned to her friend Humphrey Packington, another staunch Catholic who lived at the nearby Harvington Hall, a manor house that was filled with secret hiding places for Catholic priests. Now we're going to bring in another element to this story, so hold on to your hats. According to JOANNA, Humphrey Packington had somehow become associated with the Rosicrucians, despite the fact that Catholics weren't altogether fond of them, and the fact that the Rosicrucian movement was more aligned with Protestant Reformation. In 1972, just 7 years before this whole psychic quest began, historian Francis Yates released The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, a book that was well received upon its release but later became somewhat contentious. It focused on the influence that occultist John Dee had had on the Rosicrucian manifestos, as well as the Rosicrucians' own interest in the marriage between Frederick V and Elizabeth Stuart. Christopher Hill wrote in a 1973 review of the book that Yates argues that Frederick was deliberately built up, notably by Christian of Anhalt, as leader of a European liberal Protestant movement, of which the Rosicrucians were aligned with. Interestingly, the gunpowder plotters had planned to place the young Elizabeth Stuart on the throne and forcibly raise her as a Catholic in England in 1605. So at this point, I'm sure you're scratching your head and wondering, where the hell is all of this going? And trust me, so was I. So I'm just going to let Graham fill you in on the theory here.
Was it possible that the Rosicrucians had come to an agreement with Catesby and the other English Catholics, a plan to enthrone Elizabeth with the promise of religious freedom and toleration, necessitating Catesby having the stone to assure his own success? Had Catesby, overwhelmed at possessing the Meonia stone, devised his own mad scheme, the true extent of which was unknown to the Rosicrucians until too late?
It's stretching the boundaries of credulity, and it also makes the Meonia stone sound like the One Ring and Robert Catesby sound like fucking Gollum. Either way, Humphrey Packington, who is also supposedly aligned with the Rosicrucians, ended up being tasked with hiding the Meonia stone. After he safely stored it away in an unknown location, he decided to commission a series of paintings in a hallway of his home. Inside these paintings were clues as to where the stone had been hidden. Towards the end of this third communication with JOANNA, she gave them a grave warning, much like the dark occult force that had led to the downfall of the Knights Templars and the gunpowder plotters. Another group of people would be searching for the stone, seeking to use it for their own nefarious purposes. The Parasearch group needed to find the Meonia stone by the 31st of October, a mere 2 weeks away, and JOANNA wouldn't be able to communicate with them until they did. And just like that, she was gone. The communication was ended. That must have been one incredibly taxing channeling session for poor Graham. I mean, bloody hell, she's gone from Egypt to Arthurian legends to Templars to the Rosicrucians, and now we've got the fucking gunpowder plot in it as well. And a clue to the location of a magical stone that's apparently hidden in paintings in a manor house that, again, just so happens to be up the road from them. I should point out here that according to a footnote in Andy's later book, JOANNA originally gave the name Mary Tudor instead of Mary Queen of Scots, which, in Andy's words,
was clearly an error, but one she did not correct.
Now, I don't know about you, but I would expect that all-seeing, all-knowing JOANNA, who went to Exeter Art College with Graham, would get the bloody names right. The details are incredibly important. Unless it wasn't JOANNA at all, and it was actually just Graham making it all up, and he just gotten the names a bit muddled up. I mean, it is a convoluted story. You really can't blame him for losing track of the details. The Parasearch lads began what they called their historical detective work at Humphrey Packington's former home, Harvington Hall. It didn't take them long to find the artwork that Packington had commissioned. It was called the Nine Worthies, and they were painted on a narrow passageway in the home. Unfortunately, age had worn away at 3 of them, but the remaining 6 depicted Joshua, Samson and the Philistines, Hercules, Pompey, Guy of Warwick, and David slaying Goliath. It was this final drawing of David that really caught the Parasearch lads' attention. The longer they looked at it, the more they started to think that David looked a hell of a lot like King Arthur wielding Excalibur. In fact, all of the people depicted in the drawings seemed to be holding their weapons above their heads in a similar way. But as for deciphering a clue, they came up with nothing. If Humphrey Packington had really hidden the stone and left hints within the drawings, then he'd done a bloody good job. To crack the code, they were going to have to put themselves in his shoes. They were going to have to use Packington logic. The next stop on the Parasearch lads' historical detective tour was Huddington Court, where the gunpowder plotters had fled to after being rumbled. There was a slight problem in that it was, and still is, a private residence, but they didn't let that deter them. They told the owner of the home that they were investigating a local historical mystery, and that they had reason to believe that after the gunpowder plot, Gertrude Winter had been involved in hiding a magical stone. To the surprise of nobody at all, the homeowner had never heard a bloody thing about it, but he did say that he once heard that Gertrude had spent a lot of time embroidering mass vestments while she was imprisoned at Huddington Court, and these vestments were later taken to a Catholic chapel in Kemerton in Gloucestershire. Surely it couldn't hurt to go have a look at them.
Oh my word, we'll have a look. Of course we'll have a look.
After all, they may contain a clue. When they arrived, they met with the local priest, who told them that the vestments weren't actually made by Gertrude Winter. They were the work of Lady Mary Wynneth in the 17th century. It must have been a disappointment, but it wasn't a completely wasted journey, because the priest did end up showing them the beautiful stained glass artwork displayed in the chapel. And who doesn't love stained glass artwork? I adore it personally. As the Parasearch lads looked at them, they began to notice something familiar in one of the windows. It depicted St. George slaying the dragon, and much like the drawings back at Harvington Hall, he held his sword above his head in a very particular stance. Did it mean anything? Was this the clue that they were after? Who bloody knows? Your guess is as good as mine. Back at the Parasearch HQ, Andy began to do some research, and he discovered that this stance had a name. It was called the St. George's Parry, and the slaying of the dragon was symbolically important too. In Celtic mythology, as well as the then burgeoning field of earth mysteries, dragons were seen as a positive force. They protected the earth and represented power and wisdom. Of course, when Christianity took over, dragons were then portrayed as a negative force, and the St. George and the Dragon story became an allegory for Christianity defeating paganism. According to the Greenstone book, some people believed that the story actually represented gaining power. If the dragon is this powerful force that represents the earth, then slaying it means that you've mastered these forces. From this, the Parasearch lads decided that the St. George's Parry stance itself has two meanings: a great power over evil and a power to harness the highest spiritual forces of nature. So they started to put all of these disparate pieces of information together, and they finally decided that perhaps they were getting ahead of themselves. Instead of rushing straight to the stone, what if they needed to look for a sword first? After all, the St. George's Parry stance with the sword seemed to be a recurring clue, and they believed that King Arthur and his sword Excalibur were depicted in the Nine Worthies at Harvington Hall. Remember that King Arthur's sword supposedly possessed magical powers akin to the Meonia stone, and the legend goes that he received the sword from the Lady of the Lake.
Suddenly they knew. A lake, a stretch of water. This must be it. Hurriedly they grabbed the map and spread it on the floor. A lake, but which of the several shown on the map?
I don't know why JOANNA couldn't have just told them that the first part of the quest would involve finding a sword, but I guess that would have made things far too easy for them.
Strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. But you can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you. Shut up!
Anyway, the Parasearch lads combined their brain power and set about studying their ordnance survey maps, and lo and behold, they found a small lake next to a hill that just so happened to be called Knight's Hill. So they were like, Knight's Hill, as in Knights of the Round Table Hill? This was all the bloody confirmation they needed. But luckily for them, they got a timely phone call from their friend, Alan Beard.
I decided that I would sit down with a pad, a writing pad and a pen, in the dining room at home, to see if I could get any more impressions of where we might look to find this greenstone. No impressions came, but I did hear somebody, a voice perhaps, try to dictate something behind my head. It was as if I was listening to snatches of a conversation. The snatches that I heard gave reference to a holly bush. But the more important thing was that we weren't looking for a stone, we were looking for a sword that would lead us to the stone.
This army of psychic mates was really starting to pay off. And it's funny how they always seemed to ring up the Parasearch lads at the most opportune time. The Parasearch lads discover something by themselves, and then suddenly one of the psychic mates is on the blower to him being like, you'll never guess what I found. And it just so happens to be something that completely reinforces what they've just found. I guess that's just the way the paranormal works. Alan also told them that they should look for an old mill next to the place where they will eventually find the sword. And to the surprise of nobody at all, Knight's Hill just so happened to have an old mill next to it. So they thanked Alan for his information and told them that they were going to plan a trip there next weekend. But all of a sudden, he's like, no, absolutely not. You have got to get there ASAP. This dark evil force is beginning to draw in. You have to go now. So at this point, I feel like Andy is more kind of primed to believe what the psychics tell him. So him and Graham both decide to heed Alan's warning about getting to Knight's Hill as soon as possible. So they decide to set off at that very moment, the 22nd of October to be exact. They weren't sure what to expect on their treasure hunt, so they packed for every eventuality. They even brought swimming trunks with them. In classic British fashion, they decided to stop at a nearby pub for a pint before heading on to Knight's Hill after last orders. Again, if that was me and my mate had called me up telling me that I needed to get somewhere ASAP because a dark force was drawing in, I wouldn't be stopping for a pint. But perhaps my priorities are out of whack here. They arrived in the middle of the night and started to look around with their torches. As they walked around the perimeter of the small lake, they discovered an overgrown bridge, and next to it was a holly bush, just like Alan Beard had told them. Upon closer inspection, the bridge seemed to be too modern to have been around in Humphrey Packington's day. And remember, they were looking for a sword that he had hidden, a sword that he had left clues to in the paintings in his home. But when they looked at the foundation stones of the bridge, they deemed them old enough. Now, I'm not sure how they came to that conclusion, because as far as I know, they aren't trained archaeologists. But let's be honest, when has that ever stopped anyone? They then had to figure out whereabouts on the bridge the sword had been hidden. I mean, it could have been anywhere. But Graham and Andy came up with a novel idea, and I'll let them explain it to you.
Your picture of King Arthur wielding Excalibur in the Nine Worthies painting, he is actually standing there. As you look at him, he's looking down and to his left. And if you stood on the bridge and looked down onto the left, that's where you'd end up. And the knights on the hill gathered behind him are to his left, and that's Knight's Hill.
Yeah. And we then focused our attention on the other side of the bridge facing out onto the lake.
They then decided that they should look behind the stones of the bridge itself, and they came up with the idea of looking behind the 9th stone down and the 9th stone across. It's obviously a number associated with the 9 worthies, and also JOANNA mentioned the number 9. Also probably important to consider that Graham and Andy were, and still are, tapped into the occult, paranormal and conspiracy worlds, and were probably aware of people like Andrea Puharic and the channeling of the 9.
Maybe it's behind the 9th stone along and down from the bridge. So 9 stones along and 9 stones down, and we eventually got down to the 9th layer and the 9th stone along from the bridge. And when we removed that stone, which would be impossible to remove and covered with brambles beforehand, we saw an alcove, a small recess area
behind the stone.
And the torch, as it was shone inside, we could see that there was something long and thin inside it.
They'd only gone and found the blooming sword. Can you believe it? No, seriously, can you believe it? Like, what are the odds that they would go to the exact right place and spend ages digging out one particular stone only to find exactly what they were looking for right there? If at any point while watching this video you're thinking to yourself, gee, Emily really hasn't spent that much time being overtly skeptical about this story, my question to you at this point is, do I really need to be? And if your answer is yes, then fine, I'll indulge you for a moment. When I was researching this story, I came across a great series of articles written by Arthur B. at Fake Geek Boy, and he has his own theory on how the sword ended up in the bridge. His suspicion is that Graham perhaps got a sword and dropped it in a gap in the wall, only for it to fall down further than expected, making the partial demolition job necessary. Now, obviously it's just a theory, but it is important to point out that in the process of finding this sword, they did actually end up destroying part of this bridge.
Since 1979, because of the publicity later surrounding our search, treasure hunters have virtually demolished the other side of the bridge,
which was on property owned by the Earl of Coventry. Now, I've got no love lost for the landed gentry of England, trust me, but it is kind of funny that later on down the line, Andy decided to tell the Earl of Coventry about finding the sword in the bridge, and the Earl was like, I want the sword, otherwise I'm going to press charges against you for trespassing on my land. I mean, I'm not surprised that he reacted like that. That is exactly the kind of response that I would come to expect from the aristocracy in this country. And I can't believe that one of Andy's psychic mates didn't call him up and warn him about it. Arthur B. also goes on to make an important point.
My worry here is less for the property rights of some toff and more for the physical integrity of the historical sites and structures that Collins and his pals seem to find nothing wrong in mucking about with. Credible researchers might be able to learn something from those places if untrained amateurs leave well enough alone. But if precious archaeological sites get damaged permanently by blundering psychic questers, then we all lose out.
This seems to be a running theme throughout so many of these paranormal stories that I've researched over the years and presented on this channel. Everything from the lore of the land to ethical behaviour takes a back seat to uncovering the mystery. The quest is the most important thing, and the quester often seems to consider themselves to be the centre of the universe. Absolutely nothing can stand in the way of one man, or, in this case, a group of men, and their pursuit of the truth. After finding the sword, Graham and Andy headed back to the Parasearch HQ and set about cleaning up the 20-inch long tapering blade. I mean, it was hardly Excalibur, but I guess it was better than nothing. What happened next depends on whose version of events that you believe. Let's start with Andy's. They cleaned up the sword and found the words Meonia for Mary written on the sword in a copper plate script. FORE was spelled with an E at the end, and the meaning of the word is situated or placed in front. So this engraving meant Meonia before Mary, and they also found a raised monogram on the hilt of the sword. Andy then claimed that at that very moment he looked at his surroundings in the Parasearch HQ and caught a glimpse of a book that they had checked out of the library about Mary, Queen of Scots. The same monogram on the sword just so happened to be on the front cover of the book. Again, what are the chances? Unless Graham had made the sword himself and made sure that the book was in the apartment and that the monogram was visible. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. It's like I'm possessed by the spirit of skepticism. And this story is so ridiculous that, like, there's literally no point even debunking it because it's just so stupid and silly that you may as well just enjoy it. But there's something that just comes over me. It's like JOANNA inside me, but instead it's like the spirit of the worst skeptic known to man. And I'm like, oh, I need to tell people this isn't true. Anyway, I'll carry on. Graham and Andy theorised that the sword may have actually belonged to Mary, Queen of Scots herself, and they decided to hide it underneath a chest of drawers in the bedroom and to not tell anyone about it. Nobody's going to know about this. Not Terry, not Alan, not even Marion. They eventually went to bed and they got a few hours sleep before waking up the next morning to pick up a van. They then drove to the printers and picked up copies of their magazine Strange Phenomena and began their drive across the country to deliver them. I'm assuming they were dropping them off to various newsagents and maybe kind of esoteric magical shops across England that were selling them. On their journey, they ended up visiting Marion's house and she grilled them on what they'd been up to. But obviously they decided to keep mum about finding the sword. So instead of telling her about it, they asked her if she could pick up on any psychic images.
I had a psychic impression myself and I could see water, what appeared to be a very still lake. I saw a large slab of stone. Resting on the slab of stone was a sword. And with that, I got an intense, overwhelming smell of rotting, decaying vegetation. It was very unpleasant.
She told them that she had had a similar image come into her head the night before, the same night that they had uncovered the sword. At that point, Graham and Andy were getting a little bit freaked out because as far as they were concerned, Marion was actually seeing them in some kind of like weird remote viewed vision. So they decided to stop giving her the runaround and they came clean about finding the sword. She then decides that they all need to get organised and that they should schedule a group meeting at her house in 3 days' time. Now, in Graham's version of events, they got home, cleaned up the sword, found the engravings, picked up the van and set out on their journey. That was all the same. But that afternoon, they stopped at Terry's house and were joined there by Alan. They proceeded to show both of them the sword, and also present at this meeting was Terry's wife, Pat. Andy and Graham then drove on to Marion's house, and before they could whip out the sword to show it to her, she told them that the night before, her daughter Gaynor had a bizarre dream. She'd seen a man running through the rain in the countryside until he got to a body of water, and she saw that he was holding a bundle of cloth close to his chest. He got to a bridge and disappeared for a while, before reappearing without this bundle of cloth. She assumed that he had hidden whatever was being held inside. In this version of events, Graham and Andy were shocked because they hadn't told Marion a thing about finding the sword, and Gaynor supposedly didn't know anything about JOANNA or the psychic quest. Could it be that she had had a psychic vision of somebody hiding the sword in the very bridge where Andy and Graham had just found it? After that revelation, they decided to tell Marion about finding the sword, and she immediately fell into a trance state, like something decided to jump into her body and use it as a vessel to convey an important message. She said,
"I can only tell you this. The seeds of destruction lie within."
And just like that, whoever it was that had taken over her body disappeared. And Marion was back like nothing had even happened. Later on, she tried to figure out who exactly had spoken through her. And she claimed to see the image of a white horse and a row of trees with an old track between them, near a body of water. Immediately, she declared that this is where they will find the Meonia stone. She was absolutely adamant about it. Now, these two versions of events are completely different and they totally contradict one another. Andy's version seems a little more grounded, with Marion simply getting a psychic impression of them finding the sword. Whereas in Graham's account, we've got Marion's young daughter Gaynor having dreams about Humphrey Packington hiding the sword, and then Marion being used as a vessel for some unknown entity. I must say, Graham's version is a little more dramatic. It feels like it's got a little bit more pizzazz to it. It also included the scary warning from Marion, which, combined with Alan's fear of a dark force drawing near, apparently inspired Andy to visit a bookshop in London. It was there that he found a magazine article about the Valentine's Day murder of Charles Walton and the supposed connection to witchcraft and the occult.
In 1945, on the slopes of Meon Hill, an event took place which brought witchcraft into the national dailies. A particularly gruesome murder was committed, which soon became known as the witchcraft murder. A hedge cutter in his 70s, his name was Charles Walton, was murdered on the 14th of February, St. Valentine's Day. He was battered to death with a stick, and he was pinned to the ground with his own pitchfork, which was thrust on either side of his neck, through the neck.
The case was investigated by famous detective Robert Fabian, who theorised in his book, Fabian of the Yard, that Walton had been killed in a reproduction of a druidical ceremony. There were other investigators too.
Charles Walton's case aroused the interest of Margaret Murray, the celebrated Egyptologist and archaeologist. She was then in her 90s, but she came down to the village to stay there and investigate the case personally. And she said that she was 95% certain that the killing was a witchcraft killing, that Walton had been murdered to replenish the earth.
It was a strange theory, and one that Charles Walton's family took to task.
Mrs. Good, Charles Walton was living with you at the time of the murder. Do you think that there was any chance that witchcraft played any part in his death at all?
No. I think the papers made a lot of it. And I lived with him all my life, and I've never known such things. I think it's ridiculous, really, the things that were said.
What did you think about the theories in the newspapers?
And, what the paper said was very disturbing, because none of it was true.
There's a lot more to the Walton case, and I've considered covering it on this channel for a while, so if that's interesting to you, let me know in the comments down below. For some reason, over the years, people have made the claim that Meon Hill, where Walton was found murdered, was very close to a megalithic site called the ROLLRIGHT Stones. In reality, the ROLLRIGHT Stones are about 15 miles away from Meon Hill, but that hasn't stopped anyone from spreading the idea that somehow his murder was connected to the stones. In the article that Andy read, the writer claimed that Charles Walton had been murdered by witches because he had refused to return a gemstone that had been entrusted to him. Now, personally, I've never heard this theory anywhere else, and I couldn't find the article that Andy claimed to have read. But immediately, the Parasearch lads began to make connections. Firstly, Meon Hill sounds remarkably like Meonia. Maybe remarkably is a stretch, but they definitely sound similar. Secondly, they had been continually warned about an evil presence, perhaps the same evil presence responsible for Walton's murder. And thirdly, they made a big deal about Huddington Court, which was the home of Gertrude Winter, being 20 miles away from Meon Hill. Somehow that's connected to all of this, but your guess is as good as mine. Could Charles Walton really have gotten hold of the Meonia stone somehow, only to then be murdered by witches or druids or whoever? Who bloody knows? But the Parasearch lads weren't about to take any chances.
And the only thing that remains are the ROLLRIGHT stones.
On the 27th of October, a group meeting was convened at Marian's house. In attendance were the psychics Terry and Alan, Andy and Graham, and a woman named Janet Morgan, who was an old school friend of Graham's. He'd told her about the psychic quest, and instead of being freaked out or skeptical, she was all in and decided she wanted to be involved too. I wonder what my response would be if an old school friend called me up and was like, look, you're not going to believe this, but I am in the middle of some crazy shit. I am on a psychic quest. I like to think that I would park my skeptical side for a moment and let myself become involved in some kind of magical adventure. But honestly, who knows? I mean, it's not every day that you get to go on a quest like this. They all chatted for a while, probably had a couple of cups of tea, maybe something stronger, but it soon descended into what I can only describe as a group hypnosis session, with Graham leading the rest of the group as they all began to receive psychic messages. Now, this hypnosis session isn't written about in The Green Stone, and it only appears in Andy's later retelling of events. And again, I can only assume that they didn't want hypnosis to become the headline. Obviously, the events of the book are much more believable if people are just falling into trances left, right, and centre. Marion kicked things off by claiming to see an avenue of trees. She then saw a dark-haired woman that she believed was the head of a coven of witches that congregated at the ROLLRIGHT Stones. She also coincidentally, mentioned the murder of Charles Walton and hypothesized that perhaps the gemstone that he was supposedly carrying wasn't the Meonia stone, but another stone that belonged to these dark witches. This second stone, she said, could do the Parasearch lads serious harm. According to Andy, in that year, 1979, both him and Graham had been socialising with the creme de la creme of London's witches. I mean, they do write an occult paranormal magazine, so it's not altogether surprising. These witches had asked them to photograph a Halloween ceremony at the ROLLRIGHT stones. Could it be that these were the same coven of witches that Marion had seen in a vision? Don't ask me. I have no answers for you. I am merely here to convey nonsense. Alan reinforced her message and said that during the week, the words "beware the round stone" came into his head. He also got psychic images of a Ministry of Defence airfield, and he told them that he felt that it was close to where they would eventually find the Meonia stone. According to him, if they followed the airfield runway, it would bring them to a wooded area and a house at the end of a long lane. Then Terry Shotton got a vision of a brass casket, and he felt that inside it they would find the magical stone. The good one, that is. Alan piped up and was like, hang on a minute, I've been having visions of a casket too. How coincidental. So at this point, they're looking for an avenue of trees near a body of water, possibly near an airfield, somewhere close to where they found the sword. Yet again, they pulled out their trusty maps and set about looking in the area where they found the sword, and they saw that there was indeed an airfield nearby. Towards the end of the airfield, there seemed to be a wooded area and a house, just like Alan had seen in his vision. Now, Alan definitely didn't consult the lay of the land first and then tell everyone during a hypnosis session. And he definitely wasn't in cahoots with Graham in orchestrating this thing in some capacity. That is definitely not what happened, and the insinuation is downright insulting to everybody involved. Time was seriously starting to run out. At this point, they only had 5 days left to find the stone, and it wasn't looking good. They collectively decided that their first point of call was to be Meon Hill because of the claimed connection between this quest and the murder of Charles Walton. Andy, Graham and his friend Janet arrived there and found nothing, and Graham later wrote that he found it difficult to believe that somewhere in the area there might exist a satanic order of witches, a diabolical cult who had killed once and could, if the need arose, kill again. See, even the Parasearch lads are finding this story, which arguably they made up, a little hard to swallow. But just on the off chance that it was true, they decided that their next point of call should be the ROLLRIGHT stones themselves.
Just a few meters from the busy road, hidden inside a small copse, lie an ancient group of monuments, some even older than Stonehenge. There are 3 separate groups of stones here, each with a rather peculiar name. The stone circle at its heart is called the King's Men. 400 meters away, there's a group of larger standing stones dubbed the Whispering Knights.
The 1970s in England saw a rise in popularity in the fields of earth mysteries and alternative archaeology, with a focus on ley lines and ancient sacred sites. It was a field deeply connected to the world of ufology, and some researchers posited that UFOs actually followed ley lines. Funnily enough, researchers that promoted that theory even ended up in my hometown in the late 1970s while we were in the midst of a UFO flap, and their theory was that the entire town was situated on a ley line. Maybe that's why I make these videos. Maybe it's the earth calling to me. I'll be real, living here sometimes does feel like I'm living on top of a Buffy the Vampire Slayer style hellmouth, but that could also be said for a lot of places in England. Books that promoted these theories became increasingly popular. There were titles like John Michel's View Over Atlantis, which historian Ronald Hutton described as the book which more than any other defined and energized the Earth Mysteries movement. It's also a book that is listed in the appendix of the Green Stone. In 1977, the Rollright Stones became a focus of the Dragon Project. It was founded by the editor of the magazine Lay Hunter, Paul Devereaux, and led by what The Guardian called a mixed bag of scientists and fringe investigators. The project sought to study the ancient sacred sites of England, to explore rumours about the power and properties of ancient, especially prehistoric, sacred places and monuments. I can't be 100% certain, but I'm fairly sure that it was named the Dragon Project because dragon lines were used as an alternative name for ley lines, and they initially focused on the Rollright Stones. They used ultrasonic detectors as well as Geiger counters, and they seemed to pick up unusual pulses, although the results have been disputed and debated over the years. The UFO experiencer John Avis was actually supposed to be involved in the Dragon Project, but he pulled out at the last minute because he felt that something wasn't right. According to an article written by Andy in 1981,
he felt that in recent years, the Rollright Stones had been desecrated by the performing there for a black magic ritual which had involved an animal sacrifice of some nature. For this and other reasons, he said that the ebbs and flows of the supposed Earth energies had been irreparably interrupted, the effect of which would cause a certain amount of coincidental bad luck for those involved, the apparent consequences of an imbalanced sacred site.
All that is to say that during the era of the Green Stone story, the Rollright Stones also found themselves at the centre of this Earth Mystery storm. And this was a community that the Parasearch group were also deeply involved in. Just like with the rising popularity of the Rennes-le-Château conspiracy, the influences behind this story become glaringly obvious if you know what was going on at the time it was written. When the group arrived at the Rollright Stones, it was a warm Sunday afternoon. They walked around the circle known as the King's Men and attempted to count how many there were. The legend goes that you cannot actually count how many stones there are, which I think is just a cover story for the amount of people that go there and just forget halfway through. They then went to speak to one of the wardens there and asked them about witchcraft. The warden told them that years ago people had tried to connect the murder on Meon Hill to the Rollright Stones, but as of right now there wasn't much witchcraft activity going on, and they didn't seem to know anything about a witchcraft ceremony that was due to be held on Halloween. After having a bit of a natter with the warden, they moved on to look at the Whispering Nights, which is still part of the Rollright Stones, but it's not in the main circle. When they got there, they looked over the railings and they saw a small bunch of intertwined leaves and stalks filled with black and red berries. Now, I would have looked at that and gone, oh, that's nice. Someone's left it as a kind of tribute. But they looked at it and immediately thought of the occult and witchcraft. And in this story, all of those things are bad, evil. It's this dark force coming after them. Sorry, I'm getting quite animated. Now, here's where we get to another contradicting story. In Graham's version of events, it's never mentioned that they had been asked by a group of witches to photograph their ceremony at the Rollright Stones on Halloween. Instead, we get this ominous and spooky tale about finding these leaves and berries on one of the stones. Then they booked into the White Hart Hotel in the nearby town of Moreton in Marsh and made plans to head back to the stones that evening to see if any of these witches showed up. From the hotel, Andy made a phone call to Marion, who was frantic and terrified. She told him that Gaynor had had a vision of them being in grave danger. Gaynor had seen an evil woman with long black hair laying a sacrilegious offering on a stone slab. The very same intertwined leaves and berries that had been laying on the Whispering Nights. Marion then insisted that they make the journey to her house in Wales that evening. Now, I must say again, Graham's version is all about the drama, whereas Andy's feels a little more sedate. His version goes a little differently. He still called Marion and she was still a little frantic, but she told him that Gaynor had been holding the sword, which I guess they just left it at her house. Gaynor had seen an image of a servant-like figure running along a footpath near water with a pouch in his hand. And although Gaynor couldn't see inside the pouch, she felt that the green stone was hidden inside. She then said that Gaynor believed that she would be able to lead the group to the stone if she can take the sword to where it was found. She's also talking about a ruin we must find, which is connected with a cross, a tunnel, and a large bird of some kind. Much like the green stone version of events, Marion insisted that they make the drive from Moreton in Marsh to North Wales that evening, and that they were all to look for the stone together. She'd even arranged for Gaynor to have the day off school. I'm not sure what her excuse was when she called up Gaynor's teacher, but I assume that she didn't blurt out that her daughter was embroiled in a psychic quest. Marion was also very quick to point out that this vision had happened without any prior prompting, just in case you thought that she was making all of this up. Now, there's not a huge discrepancy between these two versions of events, but there's enough to make you raise an eyebrow and wonder who, if anyone, is telling the truth. In both versions, they ended up driving almost 3 hours to Marion's home in North Wales, where they spent the night. And the next morning, they all headed back to where the sword was originally found. When they got there, Gaynor took the sword in her hands and stood above the bridge where Graham and Andy had found it lying behind a stone slab. She began to turn and pointed the sword out in front of her like some kind of deadly dowsing rod. She even claimed that it vibrated in her hand. She did a 360-degree turn with it and then told her mother that they would find a ruin 2 miles away to the southeast. When Andy checked the map, he saw that there was indeed a ruin around 2 miles away called Dunstall Castle, which just so happened to be up the road from an old airfield called RAF Defford. Now, what were the chances of that? Alan's been banging on about this bloody airfield being important for ages, and now they've gone and found it. They immediately headed towards the ruin, which, sadly, was built in the 18th century, so it wouldn't have been there during the time of Humphrey Packington, who is supposedly the person that has left all of these clues that will eventually lead to the stone. In a footnote in his later book, The Seventh Sword, Andy pondered on it.
Why it should have been used as a psychic clue in a quest which had seemingly been laid down over 100 years before the castle's construction has never been made clear.
Yeah, I wonder. I wonder why it's part of this psychic quest. Again, I'm sorry to jump in with the spirit of skepticism, but it could not be more obvious that Graham has made this whole thing up. I mean, it's 1979. You can't get on Google and start finding out exactly when these buildings were actually built. I can just imagine the poor sod at Wolverhampton Library poring over all of the historical records trying to find out which location fits and which doesn't. And he probably got to this one and there probably wasn't a date on it, and he was like, oh, don't worry, nobody will ever know, not envisioning the world that we live in now. Anyway, get out of me, skepticism be gone. We're enjoying the story. When they arrived at Dunstall Castle, Gaynor was adamant that they go inside the central tower, what's now known as the Panorama Tower. Initially, Marion was hesitant to let her 12-year-old daughter go inside a crumbling building, but she eventually relented and let Gaynor follow Andy and Graham up the spiral staircase. They climbed a few stairs and suddenly, out of nowhere, they heard what could only be described as a bird beating its wings. Not long after, stones and fragments of the fragile building began to fall on top of them. At this point, Graham and Andy wanted to get the hell out of there. They'd already demolished part of an old bridge. They did not need to have Dunstall Castle resting on their conscience too. But Gaynor was having absolutely none of it, and she told them to keep bloody going. We've got to get to the top, lads. We need to find out what's up there. But the more they climbed, the louder the noise became, and even more rubble started falling down. Graham finally took charge of the situation and told them that they were not going any further. They had no idea what was up there. It could have been bloody Q the Winged Serpent for all they knew. In reality, I think that they were all just creeping around a literal ruin that probably just had a big bird's nest at the top. But they were seriously spooked by it, and they decided to come back down. Now remember that in Andy's version of the phone call to Marion from the day before, she had mentioned that Gaynor had had a vision of a large bird of some kind, and it seemed that she was right yet again. When they got back outside, they found Marion speaking with a young woman who was walking a horse, and she had given them some interesting information. She says that this place is Dunstall Castle and that it's linked with the Earl of Coventry's estate at Croom Court. And remember what Gaynor said about the tunnel? Well, apparently, a tunnel goes from here to the site of a local manor house. Gaynor had also had premonitions of a cross, and Andy claimed that they had found a memorial cross in the village down the road. So here they were with all 3 premonitions checked off the list: a bird, a cross, and a tunnel. They must have been on the right path, but they still hadn't found the stone. At least, not yet.
Ride away, swan, let the people of the building will you along.
Back at Marion's home in North Wales, with Gaynor safely tucked in bed, and with the psychics Alan and Terry having joined them, the group decided to consult the maps once again, thinking that perhaps they'd missed something or that they weren't using quite enough Packington logic. This time, Marion's husband Fred decided that he wasn't going to be a silent bystander. He was ready to roll his sleeves up and get involved. He asked both Andy and Graham if there were any other sites connected with the gunpowder plot that hadn't already been investigated. And, as it turned out, they hadn't actually been to Woollas Hall, which displayed a portrait of Robert Winter, one of the gunpowder plotters. With that in mind, Fred drew a ring around Woollas Hall on the map and then said,
"Now the River Avon cuts across the whole of this region, so any servant would have to use a bridge to cross that. Bear that in mind. However, I would now concentrate your efforts in this area. The stone probably lies somewhere here near running water."
While her husband was focused on the maps, Marion turned her attention to the inscription on the sword, Meonia for Mary, and she said, "Maybe the monogram and inscription are saying that we should look towards Mary Queen of Scots for the final clue." Marion just so happened to have a book in her house on Mary Queen of Scots, so she picks it up as a browse through it, and an image inside caught her eye. It was of an embroidered panel that Mary had completed in 1569 of a large swan-like bird known as a dowker. Marion then claimed that Mary was known as the Swan by the Catholics, which I haven't been able to corroborate anywhere else, and trust me, I spent far too long looking. I'll be honest with you, quite a few times during the research and writing stages of this project, I questioned my life choices. I wondered, how the hell did I end up here? But hey ho, I guess I'm just living on a ley line. There was, however, a link between the Rosicrucians and a star in the Cygnus constellation. Cygnus being the Latin word for swan. In August 1600, P Cygni, one of the most luminous stars ever discovered in the Milky Way, was observed by Dutch astronomer Willem Janszoon Blauw. Then, in 1604, a second nova appeared within the Serpens constellation. Both of these new stars were written about by Johannes Kepler in his 1606 book to stellar nova, which included an illustration of the star in the swan's neck. These new astronomical discoveries were inspiring for the Rosicrucians, and in 1615, when the confession of the Rosicrucian fraternity was unleashed upon the world, it referenced these new stars as the two extraordinary phenomena in the heavens, heralding the new age of global reformation announced and called for by the secret fraternity founded by Christian Rosencreutz. You can see both stars depicted in the illustration of the Temple of the Rose Cross, published in 1618. Now remember that in this story, the Rosicrucians and the gunpowder plotters are in cahoots for some reason, despite their aims being quite different. According to the Parasearch lads, the Rosicrucians sympathised with the gunpowder plotters' idea of putting Princess Elizabeth, who was Mary Queen of Scots' cousin, on the throne in England and forcibly raising her as a Catholic. So the cogs are beginning to turn in Graham's mind while he's looking down at the map. He's thinking, all right, gunpowder plotters have been given the Meonia stone by Mary Queen of Scots, who may or may not have been called the Swan, and the plotters were working with the Rosicrucians, who also took an interest in the new star in the swan's neck. According to Graham's account, he looked down at the area on the map that Fred had helpfully circled, and he found a great bend in the river near the village of Burlingham, marked the Swan's Neck.
I found it. I found the stone. Oh God, I feel sick.
The Meonia stone was buried in the swan's bloody neck. Bloody hell, it is about time that they figured it out. Whew, it's almost time for tea. Now, when it comes to finding the stone itself, you will not be surprised to hear that Andy and Graham's version of events do differ. Although it's important to remember that in each version, it is Graham that points to the swan's neck as the burial place, and it's Graham that goes it alone to find it. Yes, my friends, that is right. After all of this group psychic questing, they've all been kind of working together. They've been this psychic dream team. Graham sets out on his ones to dig it up and doesn't tell anyone about it. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, and I'm also getting excited so the more kind of Cockney side comes out. In Andy's account, he and Graham, along with Alan and Terry, made a plan to visit the Swan's Neck the next day at 3 p.m. Marion and Gaynor couldn't go because Gaynor's got school and she's already been taking a bunch of time off to traipse through the countryside with a bunch of fully grown adults looking for a bloody stone. However, after they make the plan, Andy said that Graham turned around and clenched his fists, a look of frustration in his eyes. They then returned back to the Parasearch HQ. It's a bit of an odd reaction to have. I mean, you'd think that he'd be quite euphoric at this point. The quest is beginning to all come together. They're all about to find this stone. I don't know why he's so annoyed. That morning, Graham woke Andy up at around 9 a.m. and told him that he was going out to make final checks on the Swan's Neck and that he would call him later on to arrange a place to meet. Little did Andy know that Graham had supposedly woken up that morning and he'd suddenly felt a sense of urgency to get to the Swan's Neck then and there and to find the Meonia stone himself. I mean, in fairness to him, it was now the 30th of October and they only had one more day to find it. Instead of actually telling Andy that he was planning on going to the Swan's Neck to retrieve the stone that they've all been searching for weeks now, he just mentions these final checks like a last minute spot of research and then sods off. Honestly, what a sneaky git. I would be bloody fuming if I was Andy and I found out that my mate had gone off searching for that stone without me. And it also makes me wonder whether this kind of feeling that he woke up with, this convenient cover story about how they needed to get to the stone then and there, was just that, a cover story. And I'm definitely not insinuating that he buried it himself and decided to find it himself to avoid any further scrutiny. I'm definitely not making that insinuation. When Andy woke up that morning, he received a phone call from Marion, who told him that Gaynor had awoken from a vision of her and the Parasearch lads back at Dunstall Castle, where she saw a huge white swan launching itself into the sky with a leather pouch tied around its neck. Inside the pouch was the Meonia stone. Now, Andy was taken aback at Gaynor's dream. After all, she'd been asleep last night when they all decided to look towards the swan's neck. How would she have known? I mean, her mother wasn't in the room and also wasn't heavily involved in pointing the entire group towards the swan's neck. And her mother wasn't the one making the phone call to Andy to relay the dream. Wait, hang on a minute, that's not right. Again, I'm making the insinuation here that perhaps Marion told Gaynor about the swan's neck, but that's just my theory. Now, in Graham's version of events, he dips out to find the stone himself, and he writes about a phone call that morning from Marion to Alan Beard, where he says that she told him about what had happened the night before, even though he was there. At least he was there in Andy's account. In Graham's, he's been totally written out of the prior evening's proceedings, and now he's apparently hearing all about this for the first time. Anyway, she tells him that Gaynor's had another bloody dream, this time of a brass casket, which she believes contained the Meonia stone, and another one.
Inside the brass casket they would find 2 stones. They must touch neither. The second stone was for protection, a guardian. To touch it meant death. To touch the Meonia stone would mean that the opposition would know it had been found. Not until the last possible moment would it be safe to touch it. Not only would they know, but they would also be able to trace it.
Bear in mind that both Alan and Terry had already mentioned the brass casket during the group hypnosis session, which only appears in Andy's version of events. My theory for why Graham left this out of the green stone was that it kind of sounds a little more magical and dramatic if it's Gaynor, a child, having this vision. She becomes a central figure in the story. She's like bloody Danny Torrance. Now, while all of these phone calls are going on, Graham arrived at the Swan's Neck by himself, and he was at a loss of where to even begin. As he looked around, he noticed an avenue of trees, as well as an old cart track, just like Marion had previously envisioned. If she had seen this exact spot, then perhaps she had somehow psychically projected there. Unbeknownst to her, perhaps she had remote viewed the exact location of the Meonia stone. And if she had, then she could have been standing right on the bloody stone itself. So the key here, in Graham's mind at least, was to figure out the exact location that Marion would have been standing in. And he tried in vain for a while, but he didn't have much luck. He decided to head back to the car to call Marion and ask her himself. But when he arrived, he claimed to be overwhelmed by the feeling that he must go back, that he couldn't call for help, and that he needed to find the stone right now. So instead of calling Marion, he picked up his spade and trowel that he'd brought with him and headed back to the general vicinity where he thought that Marion would have been standing. And wouldn't you know it, as soon as he gets back to the Swan's Neck, he suddenly knows exactly where to dig. Graham dug 2 holes in the ground and came up with nothing. But on his 3rd try, he soon found a metal casket around 8 inches long, 5 inches deep, and 5 inches wide. He quickly cleaned it up and used a penknife to open the lid, and inside it he found a small silver box about 3 inches square, adorned with a simple crisscross design. Inside was a small green stone, much like this one. I'm just kidding, this fell off an old necklace, but let's suspend disbelief for a moment and believe that I actually have the Meonia stone. It's this stone that's given me the power to read and research this whole thing, write this script, and then sit here for almost 3 hours recording just part 1 of this story. Graham was in a state of shock. He couldn't believe that he'd actually found it. A magical stone that had been passed from the megalithic people to ancient Egypt, to Arthurian legends, to the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, and the gunpowder plotting Catholics. When he went to pick it up, he suddenly got the sense that he shouldn't, and it was at that point that he noticed a small black rectangular object about 1 inch long, 1/2 inch wide and deep. Now, this is where things get utterly ridiculous. And I know you're probably thinking that things are already utterly ridiculous, but trust me, we're going to turn it up to 11. Graham got the psychic message that he needed to throw the black object away without touching it. Now, he didn't question this urge whatsoever. He just immediately grabbed his trowel and used it to lift up the black object, and he hurled it into the nearby river. When he got back to the car, he decided to slide the green stone into a paper bag and put it in his pocket. Then he went back to the location where he had found the casket and reburied the silver box that he had found inside it. His supposed reasoning was that these dark oppositional forces were starting to draw in, and they couldn't know that the stone had been found. It really makes no sense at all, because if they had gone to find the stone themselves, all they would end up finding would be an empty silver box, so they would know anyway that it had been found. Graham did have an answer for that, but apparently he couldn't make good sense of it, and it had something to do with leading them astray into believing that a third party had found the stone. So after burying the empty box, Graham got yet another psychic impression. It informed him that he was to tell absolutely nobody that he had found the green stone, and he was to take it straight to Gaynor before anyone else could touch it. Graham put in a phone call to the Parasearch HQ, where Andy, Janet, Terry and Alan were all sitting around anxiously waiting for him. He told them to meet him back at Knight's Hill, where they had originally found the sword. After convening there, they would then move on to the Swan's Neck. When the group finally met up, they asked him where he'd been, and he just told them that he'd been doing some extra research in the library. But as they made their way to the Swan's Neck, Andy noticed
something a little strange as I lagged behind talking to Graham. His hands were fairly dirty, and yet he had not mentioned any digging to us. What had he been up to before our arrival?
I mean, seriously, come on, Graham. If you're going to lie to their faces, the least you could do would be to wash your bloody hands. I'm starting to think he hasn't thought this whole thing through. He's getting the dates wrong, he's gotten some of the names wrong, and now he's got mud on his hands, and he's going to lie to them all and be like, oh, I haven't found the stone. Honestly. On the journey to the Swan's Neck, they noticed a white Ford Escort with 2 men inside, following them at a steady pace before finally disappearing. When they parked their cars and began to actually walk down the path towards the river, Alan noticed the same car yet again.
On the hill where they had parked their cars was a white Escort. 2 figures stood on the skyline leaning over the gate. There was no doubt that they were being watched.
For all they knew, it could have just been a couple or 2 mates enjoying the view over the river. But in Graham's mind, this was proof that the oppositional forces knew that they were going to be here. And the oppositional forces drive a white Ford Escort. The white Ford Escort does not feature at all in Andy's account of the events. According to him, they parked their cars and began to scope out the landscape. And Terry eventually saw the avenue of trees that Marion had spoken of. They searched around some more, and Andy suddenly saw at least 2 freshly dug holes. Graham had barely even bothered to cover his tracks. Honestly, what a lazy git. According to Andy, Alan paced back and forth and said, No, I'm getting palpitations of the heart. I think it's still here. Poor Alan's going to have a bloody heart attack, and Graham's just stood there twiddling his dirty thumbs. They continued to dig, but none of them came up with the silver box that Graham had buried. It seemed that someone other than them and other than Graham had taken it. Graham finally convinced them all to stop looking and told them that they needed to get to Marion's house. After all, he's got to give Gaynor the stone that none of them know he's got in his trouser pocket. En route to Wales, they stopped off briefly at the Parasearch HQ, where Andy, who at this point was highly suspicious, decided to ask Graham outright whether or not he had the stone.
In response, he merely glanced through me, ignoring the straightforward question and displaying a wry smile on his trickster-like face as he passed by without a word.
If I was Andy in this situation, I would have had him up against the bloody wall. I would have shaken him down for that stone. I'd have been like, Graham, I have had enough. You are giving me the runaround. You have to come clean, and you have to come clean now. Also, like, Andy must be freaked out at this point because it is the 30th of October. They need to find this bloody thing by midnight. And Graham's being incredibly elusive. But Andy, as frustrated as he was with this trickster-like person in front of him, ended up following Graham and the others to Marion's home in North Wales.
Must be the season of the witch.
What really happened at Marion's home on Halloween 1979 will probably always remain a mystery. The only people that know for sure are those that were there, because the two written accounts that we have to go on are both completely different. In Andy's version of events, he noticed that Graham was lingering outside Marion's house after they'd all arrived. And when he approached Graham, he saw him retrieve the casket from the boot of his car. According to Andy, Graham just smiled at him and said,
"Give me 5 minutes alone with Gaynor and then come on up."
Graham then went inside the house and asked Marion if he could speak to Gaynor privately, to which Marion was like, oh yeah, just go upstairs, I'm sure she's still awake. Bear in mind that it's like 10 p.m. at this point and Gaynor is a literal child. I think it's a little strange to let a grown man go upstairs into her room. It's also a little strange to allow a child to get embroiled into this nonsense, but that's another story. While Graham was upstairs with Gaynor, they all sat around talking, and it seemed like Terry was the only one that wondered why Graham had gone upstairs to a child's bedroom in the middle of the night. He asked Marion what was going on, and she said she had no idea, so she decided to go upstairs to find out. She was gone for around 5 minutes, at which point Andy decided to go upstairs too. He found Graham sitting in front of Gaynor and Marion on her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, while Gaynor rocked back and forth with the open casket in her hands. Andy leaned over, peered into the open casket, and finally caught a glimpse of the Meonia stone. The three of them decided to go back downstairs, and Graham told all of them why he had been drawn to retrieve the stone by himself.
A large party of people trampling across private farmland would be a focus of attention and might well attract the interest of the local manor house, which, as Marion correctly predicted, was a quarter of a mile across the fields from the avenue of poplars.
So in this version of events, Graham was worried about a bunch of people trespassing. I mean, when has that stopped them before? Feels like a cop-out to me, but anyway. He eventually apologised to them all, and they all forgave him. And according to Andy, midnight passed with little incident. But the same cannot be said for Graham's version of events, which some may say is the official version of events, considering it was published as the Greenstone book. So if you're looking into this story for the first time, this version will probably be the only one that you find, unless you're like me and you enjoy giving yourself extreme brain rot and you decide to read all the versions that exist and compare them to one another. It's a good thing I did though, because I think it makes for a more interesting video. According to Graham, they arrived at Marion's home around 10 p.m. on the 30th of October. He managed to covertly place the Meonia stone back into the casket without touching it. He then placed the casket inside his briefcase without anybody noticing. When they entered the home, they found Gaynor, who was supposed to be sleeping, standing at the top of the stairs, almost as if she was waiting for them all to arrive. And she said, "You've got something for me." Graham opened up his briefcase and passed her the casket. She studied the Meonia stone for a while before picking it up and passing it to her mother, telling her that she must use it. She then just smiled at them all and went back to bed as if nothing had ever happened. As the clock struck midnight on the 31st of October, they decided to pass the Meonia stone amongst themselves, and they began to get weird vibrations and strange feelings from from it. When Marion took hold of it, she laid back in her chair and told everyone to sit around her in a semicircle. It was at that point that she went into another trance. Suddenly, she was no longer in the room. She found herself psychically projected to an unknown location where she could see trees and feel the wind whipping around. Then she heard the sound of people chanting and noticed that a fire was crackling away. But that wasn't all. All of a sudden, she saw a circle of hooded figures standing around the fire inside a ring of stones. It certainly looked like the witchcraft ceremony that had been scheduled for Halloween at the ROLLRIGHT stones. Amongst the figures, she saw the woman with long black hair, the terrifying high priestess of the coven. The woman began to scream, and as she did, a sickly orange light appeared in the darkness above her. It was at that point that Marion knew that she was pure evil. And while she stared at this orange light, it began to take the form of a huge winged mass that began to scream alongside the woman. Marion felt that the only way to stop this evil force was to use the power of the Meonia stone that she was holding in her hand. So she concentrated really hard, and for a moment she felt the intense evil projected back onto her. It was almost too powerful, but then she received another psychic message. Use the stone to reflect its power. So she did just that, and suddenly a bright white light burst all around her, and the woman, once powerful and terrifying, fell to her knees and then ran off.
The power of the witch coven and their priestess was at last broken. The demon was gone.
And just like that, Marion opened her eyes and declared the entire thing to be over. We've done it. We've won. Now we can rest. That was it. The whole thing had been wrapped up with a neat little bow, and Marion had defeated the forces of evil. But little did they know that while they had indeed beaten the evil coven of witches, this was simply the first battle. The dark power now knew exactly who they were, and the saga of the Green Stone was only just beginning. That feels like a nice place to leave the story, and if I carried on, we'd probably be looking at a 4-hour video at this rate, because I've been filming this for 3.5 hours now, and I know it's probably not 3.5 hours long because I tend to take some breaks and I have to change the batteries and do all of that kind of stuff, but bloody hell am I knackered. But don't fret, I will be back in a few weeks to carry on the story, so keep your eyes peeled for part 2. In the meantime, I really want to know what you guys think about this story so far, and I cannot wait to read your comments. And I also want to know your theories on why Andy and Graham's accounts are so different, especially in this last part of the story, because Andy straight up says that absolutely nothing happened on Halloween, while Graham claims that Marion essentially defeated the forces of evil. When I started the research process for this video, I really didn't think that I was going to be able to top the insanity of the Montauk project, but lo and behold, I fear we may have done it. If you can believe it, the story does get even more wild and ridiculous in the second part, and there is a sequel to this whole story, so who knows, I might cover that eventually as well. Anyway, thank you for watching the video, and as always, thank you to my wonderful patrons for continuing to support the channel. If you want to become a patron, then you can do so by following the link in the description and the pinned comment. There are Patreon only podcasts and videos, and you also get early access to videos too. And I honestly cannot overstate just how much the support means to me and how much it enables me to make these videos. So thank you from the bottom of my cold heart. All right, that's all I got. I got to go get a cup of tea. I got to go for a walk. I need to touch some grass after that. So I will see you all in a few weeks for part 2 of the Green Stone.